Yeah. So, all right, on to part two. So, taking a step back and thinking about how we're going to use jumping exercise to train volleyball players, I think that injury prevention is a component of it. I think that movement perfection is a component which is not wholly independent of injury prevention, but is fairly related. But basically, you want them to be aware and to be very in control of the movements that they're making. And you can use jumping exercises to teach them this. In volleyball, they have all these movement patterns that they do, whether it's approach jumps, block jumps, all this other stuff. I'm not going to get into volleyball from a technical aspect because I don't know it, but from what I can tell, they do all this stuff and they seem to know what they're doing, but some do it better than others. And the ones who are doing it poorly, a big part of it is because they don't have good, whether you want to call it proprioception or movement skills or motor patterns or whatever, they don't move very well. And so we seek to fix this by teaching them basic movements and then ramping up with our progressive program to more advanced movement skills. And that if they can, the idea is that if they can do these fairly advanced movements in here, when they go on the court, they'll be able to do that. One reason why you would think, oh, how come Jensen's never taken the time to learn volleyball or more about volleyball or how to do these, approach jumps or whatever it is they do? It's because I really don't care. And I say that, and I don't mean that I don't care about volleyball or I don't care about the athletes, but I'm never going to be a volleyball coach, and I don't want to be, and so I don't want to have any part in teaching them how to do those approach jumps or whatever jumps that they do. What I do want to teach them is to understand how they move, to move well, and to be able to control their bodies, and to be able to create a lot of force, and to be able to handle those forces when they come back down. So if they can do all these things, then I can send them off to their coach, and their coach can take them and teach them, cross over this foot and jump and swing your arm, whatever. The things that we do in here generally prepare them, and then when they go on the court, those are the specific preparations. I think it's very important that we as strength coaches always keep in mind what our role is, what our expertise is, and not step out of that, because we see coaches, sport coaches, stepping across the other way too often, and that irritates us. So we got to be sure not to do that ourselves. So in terms of movement perfection, we're trying to teach them to be aware of how they move and do that really well. Now moving on from there to what I wrote down as classical plyometrics, but what I mean by this is rate of force development and developing their stretch shortening cycle, conditioning their GTOs and their muscle spindles and their, we can get into the really basic biomechanical principles behind plyometrics, but without getting into that, we'll just say, rate of force development. Okay, so we want to make these athletes, to jump high, you got to create a lot of force. We want to make these athletes create a lot of force, and then when they hit the ground, be able to control that force. Because that's what I see a lot, and going back to the injury mechanisms, is these girls have learned to create a lot of force, they get up in the air, do their thing, and then when they come back down, Isaac Newton taught us that equal and opposite reaction. They're hitting the ground's hitting them back up with that same amount of force. That force has got to go somewhere. So, whether they flex their knees and hips and keep their legs in a line and attenuate those forces nicely in a safe way, use their dynamic structures like their musculotendinous unit to absorb forces and do it correctly and stay safe, or whether they land with a rigid posture in their lower extremities and lean out to the side and put their static structures to work in the landing scenarios and then put themselves at a higher risk of injury. Those are the two sort of scenarios here. So you know, as I go through this, you can see there's a lot of overlap between injury prevention, movement perfection, and rate of force development. But, you know, you kind of keep in mind that these things are all related, but there is some difference between each of these components separately as we go through this. And we're going to talk about implementation into the program, and this is where it's going to get a little more speculative, and we'll talk about my opinion and how I've done it in the past. But all the stuff that I've said is pretty well backed up. You know, I can give you the references for all of this stuff that says, you know, this is pretty legit, and I'm not just standing up here making this up. You know, when we think about how we're going to put jumping exercises into the program, these are the considerations that I think we really need to make. So the final thing is implementation. You know, I've talked about the role that jumping exercises play in their programming. Now, how do we decide, you know, do we do it at the beginning of the workout? Do we do it at the end? Do we, you know, do 100 reps, 1,000 reps, 10 reps? Should volleyball players even be doing jumping exercises? Well, we kind of covered that earlier, but if you look in some literature, it says you can't do plyos until you can squat twice your body weight. Well, you know, we don't get a lot of 6 foot, 140-pound volleyball players in here who can squat twice their body weight. In fact, we don't have a whole lot of athletes in the middle school and high school levels that can do that, especially the females. So I think, you know, when you hear those recommendations, those are kind of based on the most extreme plyometrics that were researched in the 50s and 60s in Soviet Russia, and then those recommendations are based on those plyometrics, and then they get applied to any plyometrics. Well, if we look at the sort of Western definition of anything that utilizes your stretch shortening cycle to create force, then even walking has a plyometric component to it, and obviously you don't need to squat twice your body weight to walk across the room. I think that, you know, if you can play sports, if you can practice sports, you can do some type of jumping exercises. You know, they're out there on the court jumping up and down. Why should we say that they have to squat twice their body weight, or even be able to squat their body weight to be able to do plyometrics in here? That's pretty unreasonable. You know, we will, we're going to talk about how, again, I'm getting off track here, but how we put these into the program. So I like to use jumping exercises as part of their warm-up for what we're going to do. Because I think that, for one, volleyball players especially are pretty familiar with jumping. Just, you know, they do a lot of it, so they're pretty comfortable and familiar with it. So we'll use basically like some minimal effort jumping exercises, which certainly have you know, an element of force production through the stretch shortening cycle. Something like wall jumps, where they're just, or ankle bounces, where they're just doing small jumps, jumping rope, things like that as part of their general warm-up for what we're going to do next. We'll follow that up with, once they've gone through general warm-up and kind of a specific warm-up to make sure that, you know, whatever we're going to do is loose and ready to go, then we'll go through and do the most kind of high-intensive plyometric exercises at the beginning before we do weight training. And I'm not going to go through all the reasons why. You know, this is pretty standard if you understand you know, much about strength coaching. We put the jumping exercises at the beginning of their program. I want them to be fresh. I want them to be functioning at their highest level when we do these movement skills, because I want to groove good motor patterns in the athletes so that those motor patterns will then transfer to all the other activities that they're doing. One question I get when I do lectures like this, one kind of big question I get is, how could, do you ever do this with athletes in a fatigue state? And my answer is no. And why do you not do jumping exercises with athletes in a fatigue state? And I think, the answer is because you end up getting a lot poorer quality of movement. And then people will say, okay, well, there's a lot of research that says that athletes are getting injured when they're in this fatigue state, so why don't you practice good mechanics when they're fatigued? That way, when they get on the court, they'll have good mechanics when they're fatigued. And it doesn't quite carry over like that. I think that it's much better to do these highly technical exercises when they're fresh and develop the good motor patterns, and that will carry through, and then address the fatigue in a separate way. If your athletes have good technique and good motor patterns, and then you do whatever you need to do to fix their energy systems so that they aren't getting fatigued by the end of the match, then those motor patterns will still be good at the end, and their risk of injury will be down. But it's easiest for us to groove these motor patterns when they're fresh, and it's easiest to have the best quality movements when they're fresh. So that's why we include them at the beginning. The other sort of, big thing, and what I really, it's probably my least favorite question, is when I've given a lecture like this, always a couple people will hunt me down and say, okay, so go ahead and give me the program. I understand this, I understand the mechanics, the biomechanics, not that hard, whatever, blah, 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 but give me the program. Do I do 3 sets of 10, 10 sets of 3? Do I have them jump this way, that way, turn around, whatever? And the answer is that there is no plan. And in fact, the idea that you want to be spoon-fed a plan is frustrating to me, because that tells me that you're not willing to do the work that's necessary to understand how to program this and how to implement it with the athletes. If there was a plan that was the best, it would have already come out, and we would all know it, and we would all just do it. The answer is that there is no plan. And it's frustrating because it kind of is evident that you're not okay with searching for the truth. You just want it given to you. And none of this really works like that. We have to always constantly be learning and being, getting better. And since years ago when I first started doing this to now, I've gotten a lot better. And 10 years from now, I plan on being even much better than I am now. And I plan on having a better understanding of how this all works, a better understanding of how to implement it, a better understanding of how to do progressions and regressions based on athlete's performance, how to manage workloads and things like that. So I think you need to change kind of the perspective you have in terms of implementation based on there is no magic number of foot contacts. That's something that's really popular in the plyometric literature for this program, for this, the intensification or whatever block, or in any program you read, they say you should have 150 foot contacts. Well, you have to differentiate between doing in some of the literature they have up to 3-meter depth drops, which is obviously unrealistic for what we're talking about here, but the difference between doing a depth drop or doing hurdle jumps or doing a single leg ladder drill or jumping rope, if I have my athletes warm up with 5 minutes of jumping rope, they're going to do more than 500 jumps. What I've seen in terms of recommendations is that most programs say, anywhere from 150 to 200 or, however many contacts. I've just blown that completely out of the water by having them warm up. So you definitely need to differentiate between the intensity of the exercise and what that means in terms of implementing it in your program. And you can't just paint with a broad brush and apply foot contacts to your program. But one thing that I think is really important is to really have a keen eye and watch the quality of movement that the athletes are displaying. And when you see them they're not being able to have close to perfect technique on exercises, especially exercises they've done either earlier in the program, up to several minutes earlier than that, or that they've done in previous sessions, when their technique declines on those and they're unable to do, multiple reps, or you see that things are falling apart, then that's when you got to stop them, right there. The other thing is, it's really hard for you to put a number down on a sheet of paper and say, this is how many we're going to do today, and we're going to stick to that. For reasons that I already said, where, intensity of foot contacts makes a big difference, but also, you don't know what they did yesterday, what they did in the past month, I find this all the time where we'll be going through and I've got a basic outline and I'm going through it with an athlete and they're jumping and doing whatever, and then all of a sudden they're kind of like, I see them favoring an ankle or something, and I'm like, what's the deal? Why are you limping? It's like, oh, well, I sprained my ankle really badly yesterday in volleyball practice. It's like, well, shit. You should have brought that up ahead of time. And maybe I should be more careful in asking them, is everything okay? Are you doing all right today? And I try to go through this with each athlete on a daily basis, but the nature of working, especially with teenagers, is that they're not good communicators and they don't tell you these things. That's an example. Another example would be they had practice yesterday and their coach did a bunch of extreme and misguided conditioning during practice, and they're really worn down physically, and so you had a plan in your head, okay, we're going to do these jumps, these jumps, these jumps, then they come in and they're just sucking at all of them. You need to cut it right there. Basically, if you have, say 50 jumps or 10 jumps or whatever, and you get through a number of them, and then you see their skills declining and they're not doing it right, what do you have to gain from pushing forward with your plan? Nothing, except for practicing crap. And, we're sitting here trying to say, okay, we want to ingrain these great motor patterns that are going to help them stay safe and, help them perform well and all these things. But then you'll go through and 70% of their movements are bad. So now you've done 30% good, 70% bad. What have you really ingrained in your athlete? So you need to be conscious of that, and we're always right on that fine line of, when do we call it? But I think, starting out with a good plan and then being able to be dynamic as a coach and say, this is where we cut it, or, we can push on through this as I had planned, that's, a big part of our value. And so you need to understand that this is not static, and that you need to be able to think on your feet and constantly adjust. As we go through today and work with the kids as they come in, think about these things. We're going to test their jumping, we're going to look at their mechanics, and we're going to talk about this kid and that kid and whatever, and look at all their different examples of mechanics and think about which ones are exhibiting signs that would lead them to have an increased risk for different injuries, which ones, we're going to test their vertical and their broad jump and some other things. We're going to look at, which ones have good movements that are leading to good performance. And then we're going to decide, okay, this is what we think the appropriate level of jumping is for these kids. And this is, we'll come up with that. But this at least gives us a structure for the rationale for including jumping exercises and for figuring out exactly what we want to do with them. So that when someone approaches us and says, why did you do this and not that? Or, why are you doing this at all? Or how come you're not doing more of this? We can say, it's because of 1, 2, and 3. And there's research to back this up, and this is why we do it. And not just, because this sells better, or this looks better, or you saw this in a magazine, or whatever. we want to have an emphasis on evidence-based practice, but also understand that there's a dynamic nature to this training that comes from experience, and it comes from understanding this at a really high level, and just more and more working with the girls, you'll understand when the points to push them are, when the points to pull back are, and kind of how we tell from there. So that is all for